Okay, hello everybody, welcome back after spring break, and welcome to the next third installment in our series on the desert. Today we're focusing on the desert's remarkable effect on the human imagination, and to guide us through this we have a truly star-studded lineup of college faculty drawn from a diverse array of disciplines. In alphabetical order, right in the middle of the panel, Derrick Cartwright is Associate Professor in USD's Department of Arts, Architecture and Art History. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and in a multi-dimensional career has both taught art history and has directed art museums in Seattle, Giverny, and Hanover, as well, of course, as directing USD's own network of galleries. He currently serves as Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken Museum in Balboa Park. In his role as Humanities Center Gallery Element Chair, Dr. Cartwright has been responsible for the stunning range of exhibitions that have been staged here since 2016, including the just opened Desert Sublime, one of the very best yet, I think. Please take a look at this before you leave today. Diane Hoffoss received her PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is professor in the Department of Mathematics. Her research interests are in the areas of three-manifold topology, foliations, and hyperbolic geometry, and her work has been published in such prestigious venues as the Journal of Differential Geometry. Dr. Hoffoss has also worked as a summer faculty fellow at NASA JPL, where she worked on problems involving optimizing the scheduling of communication between the Mars rovers, Mars orbiters, and the 3 deep space network communication stations on Earth. She is a core team member of the Art Builds Collective. And finally, Michael Kelly received his PhD from Fordham University and is associate professor in the Department of Philosophy. He is a specialist in contemporary continental philosophy, taught at Boston College before joining USD's faculty all the way back in 2013. He's edited 5 books and is the author of 2 monographs, the latest of which, called A Phenomenological Analysis of Envy, will be published this year, but hopefully by Routledge. And that book is emblematic of some major elements in Dr. Kelly's hugely prolific research profile, fascinatingly focused on emotions relevant to human welfare, not only envy, but also grief, hope, and emulation. So please give a very warm welcome to Professors Cartwright, Hoffoss, and Kelly.
Thank you so much for being here. Especially on Pi Day, Salvation McAfee. Special thanks also to Brian Clapp for this really inspiring choice of title and for inviting me to speak on a topic that's been very close to my heart for a number of years. Today I want to talk to you about the imaginative desert, but not about all deserts, but about one desert in particular, the Black Rock Desert, which I think is the imaginative desert. It's a desert in northwest Nevada. It's about 100 miles from Reno on a dried lake bed. But importantly, it's the annual home of Burning Man. So for those of you who don't know what Burning Man is, it's a week-long event in Black Rock City. Black Rock City is a temporary city that arises in the Black Rock Desert once a year. It's a city of 80,000 people that's almost entirely participant built. It's a community based on sort of carefully curated principles. And it's got to be the world's largest outdoor art museum. It's 7 square miles of art sculptures. So it's pretty incredible. Today's talk's going to be in 3 acts. First, I want to convince you that Black Rock Desert is the imaginative desert. Then why a desert backdrop in particular? Why is that really the right place for all this imagination to spring from? And then finally, I'll give you a little hint in terms of ripple effects, ways that this has sort of propagated out into the world. Okay. Black Rock Desert is the imaginative desert because it hosts, it inspires, and it even requires imagination and creativity in all things. So I'm going to show you a lot of pictures because I want you to get a sense of the volume of imaginative efforts that happen here. So we'll start with art. These are some favorites of mine over the years. And also just to show you a sense of the diversity of what you can see. This is Medusa Madness. You can get a sense of the scale. Here's Mike right next to it. So these are large sculptures. This is Uchronia, which is made of more than 90 miles of wood. This is Radiolumia, which is a kinetic sculpture where as the poles move in and out, those origami stars at the bottom open and close. This one's called Love. This is by a Ukrainian artist. And actually, this was in 2015, and he specifically had Russians and Ukrainians at the same camp doing the build. And he said that the merger of the inner children trapped inside the cage of the adults, he said that paralleled the friendship of the two teams in the camp trapped in the conflict of the states. This is Paraluna. This is a giant spinning disc of radial LEDs, and it spins at a speed that persistence of vision helps you fill in the gaps as it's going around. Quadrupod. This actually walks, but I haven't seen it walk. This was refurbished for this year. Aqueous. So what we're looking at is this is the top-down view, and people are walking on these. You can see people walking on these tiles, and the tiles interact with you as you walk. Right now it's just green, but you get all sorts of options. Facing the Fear Beast. This was my favorite. This was the most intense from this year by far. So this is a gruesome beast facing down this poor child, and there's an ominous voice saying terrible things to the child. You don't matter. You're not good enough. You'll never make it. You should give up. And you just feel terrible for the child, and so you want to go and protect the child. And as you get close to the child, as you protect his heart, the tone changes. The words change. It says, "I believe in you. I love you. You're worthy." It's a lovely piece. This is Broken Together by Michael Benessy. I'm sure we all can feel this way after the past couple of years. This is Bloom by Peter Hazel. One thing that's kind of nice about this, so it's a 40-foot jellyfish, and in the crown of the jellyfish, each of these smaller glass discs are handmade mini jellyfish. But there's so much art. So this is an aerial view of Black Rock City during Burning Man, and all of these, every one of these little black dots out in what's called Open Playa is another piece of art. Hundreds and hundreds of pieces of art, the style that we've seen. And every year there's a new batch. There's a few that come back, but it's mostly brand new. So there's really just volumes of art. And each art piece has its own, imaginative take. But not only that, there's some challenges for the Black Rock Desert that require imagination to address. So for example, it's incredibly hot. So it can be over 110 degrees. It can be below freezing. You're meant to plan for 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds. So it has to be a very sturdy structure that you're building. People are going to climb on it. That's what they do at Burning Man. So you need to be sure that it's relatively safe for people to climb on, or at least your project won't break. Also, how are you going to light it? So there's no light in the desert except for the moon and the stars. And so at night, everything is very, very black. So you need to light your art up. And this is your opportunity to solve this problem, but also, add some creativity, add some imagination to your piece. Also, there's no access to resources. You are very remote. So you bring what you think you need, and then if you realize that you need something else, you need to solve that problem. You need to come up with a way to get around whatever it is you're missing. Even transportation. So Burning Man only allows imaginative transportation. This is an art car, and you have to sort of pass that you're creative enough to be allowed to drive. And this is a Popo Mechanico. It's this awesome steampunk octopus whose eyeballs bug out and the arms move, and sometimes fire comes creeping out. It's Tiki Island. It's like cruise around on an island. This is Zeus. This art car is pretty. It feels ominous. These eyeballs are on a screen and they kind of dart around, and you feel like they're watching you. And you can see that Zeus is in line. There's like a turtle art car and another art car behind him. So this must be at the DMV, the Department of Mutant Vehicles. So this is where you This is where you check in to get your permit to be allowed to drive around on Playa. Boogie Bug, you can see also in line at the DMV. This is just, I couldn't find the name of this, but somebody made sort of a splashdown module, and somebody's even in their little Speedo trunks for that. Some look like the Golden Gate Bridge. This one's from Taiwan, actually. It's all made out of bamboo. It's a Buddha with a hand, and they wanted riders to have a feeling of calmness and security when they were on this art car. Even the tiniest little art cars, personal art cars, people can make and drive around like this noodle guy, or at least people trying to vacuum up all the dust off the fire. There's so many art cars. I mean, there's way too many to show you, but and each of those have their own imaginative take on what it's like to be a fun car to be in, but they also have to solve the same problems that the art does. It has to be sturdy. People are going to climb on it, but that's sort of the point, is to carry people around. People are going to climb on it. How are you going to light it? You can add some more imaginativity to your car by lighting in an interesting way. Well, there's 80,000 people, and this, I told you, it's 7 square miles. With the Pentagon, that's 3.1 miles across. You need a bike to get around. And so that means there's 80,000 bikes there. And people will often, not always, but people will often decorate their bikes in a way, partly to just express their creativity, but also it's practical. You stop at an event and there's, 3,000 other bikes there, and you want to be able to spot your bike in the crowd. They're all covered with dust anyway, so they look the same color. So it's good to have something stand out about it. So I'll just show you some examples. This guy has a steel rectangular solid for a bicycle. I've seen him ride it. It's pretty cool. All different types of takes on what it would be like to make a fun, creative bicycle to ride. And then you have to light them, because as I said, there's no light in the Black Rock Desert except for the stars on the moon. And there's cars driving around, and other bikes, so you need to be seen. So you need to make sure that your bike is lit so that you're not hit, so that you can stay alive, but also people will try to do something a little bit different, because look at the sea of bikes, and you need to spot your bike in this, right? So oftentimes people will make extra efforts to make their bike stand out in some way, and that becomes sort of a fun project in itself. Finding this solution to this. Personal lighting. You need to light yourself up as well. Not everybody goes this extreme to it, but this was our campmate Ben from last time. He's got a mushroom. These are all lighted mushrooms on me, some sort of mushroom monster. In terms of even to the tiniest detail, like the base staying alive, it's very, very hot there. You need shade, and so you need to bring your own solution to that, and that shade has to survive 100-mile-an-hour winds. So people will come up with, some camps will have some lovely structure with a nice calming, serene inside, or you may just like put some illuminate and tap it down, but you still have to solve this problem of how are you going to shade yourself. In fact, Burning Man's a testing ground for some new sort of extreme architecture. This is a hexa yurt, not because it's hexagonal, although in this case it is, but because it's made of sort of a honeycomb insulated board. And the unique problem at Burning Man is that the weathers can be terrible, but also whatever you bring needs to be portable. You're only there for a week, so you're not building permanent structures. You're bringing something that you can set up, have it stay, and then be able to move with it. Play. There's really many opportunities for play at Burning Man. People will bring, like this was right next to us in 2018, this stack of cars, and people are climbing them. And I saw this last year was a Ferris wheel that's human powered. All of this play helps you tap into the imaginative, creative kid that you once were. It's like it changes your mindset while you're there. Playfulness as well. So this was a remote control washing machine, and it was following people around in this open 3 o'clock plaza and sort of surprising people. The mouth would come up and so on. And down to the smallest little detail, even the portos. Some people will go in and make a tiki porto. I met this guy last year standing outside the Portos. He's in his ref's outfit. He's handing out red cards or yellow cards if somebody, the violation of not putting the seat lid down or not using the hand sanitizer. He goes up and gives them a card. This is really fundamental example of creative thinking, and I could spend an hour talking about this. But let me just say quickly, the founders of Burning Man imagined guidelines for a better culture, and they codified them into 10 principles. And these are the 10 principles with a little bit of a summary of what they mean. Things like radical inclusion, everyone is invited, gifting, decommodification, communal effort, we should all work together, leave no trace is very important, participation, get involved, don't just sit back, nobody should be a spectator, get involved with things. Consent is kind of an unofficial 11th principle that I decided to put down there because it's important. So my friend Arash, I was talking to him about this talk I was going to give, and he said, Burning Man is an incubator on the leading edge of how we as humans are creating the next chapter in humanity. And I just love this sentence, and I hope he's right, because my experience in a community where people are valuing, are living by the 10 principles is inspiring. It's really a beautiful place to be, and I hope this is the direction that we go. So I'll just show you a couple of ways that participants bring things to help support these principles. For example, participation, community making. This is a hug deli that somebody brings, and nobody's manning it. If you want to, you can go put the apron on, stand behind, and wait for somebody to come and need a hug. And then if they give you 2 compliments, then you can go. They can choose a hug off the menu, and then you can decide together, well, what's a gangsta hug? And so it's a chance to sort of be playful for each other, human interaction. This is a Pegasus from a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you can see, but there's these poles, and on each of these poles is a button. And if you press the button, it moves one of the legs a little bit. And at some point, you realize if you have somebody stationed at all 4 corners, and you manage to push the buttons in just the right pattern, then you get the Pegasus to run, and then flames come out the back end of the wings, and it's just encourages participation, communal effort. Leave no trace, very important principle. I mean, they take it very seriously down to the tiniest piece of glitter. I mean, it's really, really combed through, and we try to leave nothing behind. Even gray water. So you're going to produce gray water. You're there for a week, and you can't dump any of it on the fire. You have to bring it with you, evaporate it somehow. And people have different, low tech to very high tech, but personally created solutions to how to deal with gray water. Decommodification. We want to deal with each other. We want to see each other as humans. We want to relate on a human level, and not as economic actors, not sort of influenced by this sort of thing. Even to the level of some people will change the words on the movie text that they bring their camp or their art in on to avoid having that be an advertisement as well. Not everybody does, but sometimes it's fun. Experiences. I could spend an hour talking about imaginative experiences, but here's just one. This is Dance Dance Immolation. So it's Dance Dance Revolution, but with an exciting fire component when you make a mistake. And he's in sort of a fire suit with an oxygen tank coming up behind him. So I'll show you some, I think, really great examples of ways that imagination has been brought to Burning Man. But I don't want to give you the wrong impression. One thing that's very important to me and also to people at Burning Man is that there's a very low barrier to acceptance. You're encouraged to bring your own imagination, express yourself your own way, whatever that is. Nobody is judging you if your idea isn't as amazing as something like this. Everybody's encouraging. Oh, that's cool. You thought of this. That's fun. And it really it gives you the freedom to let your imagination go. It's really sort of comforting. In fact, this past year, Burning Man organization is very behind this. And one way that they sort of put this forward is that they asked that the man sculpture in the middle be a little bit less grand than in the past, because they don't want to be giving the impression to anyone that only lavish sculptures are valued. They want people to know that anything that you bring is going to be valued. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of imagination brought to, inspired by, required by the Black Rock Desert, this experience in the Black Rock Desert. But why the desert? I mean, there's some harsh conditions there. Maybe there's a better place. Well, here's what the desert offers: a scale. So it's big, and you can have really big art. And in fact, this is, as an example, this is Sonic Runway. It's 432 feet long, a bunch of loops, and it's a way to see the speed of sound. So it's got a microphone, and then it interprets sound as a visual, and then sends that sound down the set of rings so that you can see sort of sound waves going. This is called Straight Edge, and it's 2.64 miles long. That's how big the sculpture is. And these are 280 poles. They're 50 feet apart from one another. And at one end, the two lights are right on top of each other. And all the way along, one set of lights is just at ground level. I know this one's a little off, but mostly at ground level. And then the other set of lights, they've used some sort of surveying equipment to sight absolutely horizontal. And then these lights, the top lights, are going horizontal. And this lets you visualize the curvature of the Earth. So this is only 0.1% of the circumference of the Earth, but still you can see some curvature. Another thing that scale gives us is that we can bring the entire 80,000 person community together for one single event. There's shared experience there. This is for the man burn. Oh, yeah, I think that was one. Okay. Shape, that's another thing. This place is flat. It's flat and empty. And what that means is it's a beautiful, clean backdrop to whatever art you want to bring. There's a sense for artists that you're making your own home. You're putting something in nothing. So this is your space. And people see what you put in their way to see without visual distractions. Since it's very flat, you can have beautiful projected geometric shadows from art. You can have this stomping monster go along because you don't have to worry about climbing anything. The dust. Okay, the dust is a real challenge, and it's kind of it can be tiring, but it also brings some important aspects, I think, to the experience. For one thing, there's a sense of mystery and anticipation because of the partial vision, and you're not tempted to just zoom by something on your bike and give it a cursory glance. You're like, well, let me go see what this is about, and it really brings you closer to the art. It gets you to take things in, at a calmer pace. It gives this beautiful sort of ethereal cinematic backdrop to the art, and it's constantly blowing, and so there's a dynamic sort of changing setting that this art is sort of growing up out of. Especially there's this beautiful interplay with the light and the dust, especially at sunset and sunrise. So there's just some very beautiful desert scenes at night as the sun's setting. Heat's another aspect. It's very hot, and you could consider that a negative, or you can say, well, you cannot stay in the privacy of your tent. It's way too hot. So it gets you out. It gets you exploring the art, meeting other people, going to find another camp that has shade or that has misters or something. It just gets you out participating in the experience. Of course, fire. You can't talk about burning without talking about fire. And so you can have art with fire. You don't have to worry about it burning something down nearby. There's nothing nearby. Or you can burn something down. This is a temple from 2018. It's my favorite temple. And I want to just take a second to tell you about the temple. So there's a temple every year, and it's a place where people bring photos, mementos, thoughts right on the temple, things that you're grieving over, things that you need to leave behind. And then everyone comes together, and there's this shared cathartic experience where the entire building gets burned, everything goes up, and you're in the midst of an entire community who's grieving their own losses. And it's a very personal and lovely experience to have. Okay, so that's why the desert's the right place for Burning Man. Ripple effects. So there's so much, I think you can see there's just a wellspring of imagination coming out of there, but it's not limited to the Black Rock Desert anymore. It's spread both outward and inward. Outward in terms of people have written books about it. Burning Man changed the world, books on spirituality, books on culture, art books, articles about transformative effects. The art itself has been places all over the world. These two are from an installation at Smithsonian a couple of years ago. This is another Christopher Shart's piece up in Dubai. This is Constellation of One outside of the National Museum of Singapore. This is Releve at the Chatsworth House. And I only know about these because I know these people, but I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds more that I just don't know are places. The principles. So this is my friend Mike, and he Burning Man has changed him, especially in terms of leave no trace. So actually, he goes down every day and cleans the monk map at La Jolla Shores, cleans up all the trash that people leave behind, scrapes all the gum off, sweeps it off, and so it's changed him, and this is how he's bringing it out to the world. It does change people. So this article that I showed you said that 63% of participants reported a transformative experience that lasted well beyond the event itself. And I'll say it changed me, it permanently changed me in the way that I relate to people. I feel much more authentic or comfortable being authentic with people, in the way my willingness to give of myself, especially my faith in humanity. I come back each time after Burning Man, I think people aren't so bad, and I'm ready for another year. And it's also changed how I see myself as a creative being. It's given me more fearlessness to try with my imagination. And in fact, after my very first visit in 2016, it's enhanced my scholarly activity. I decided I want to bring some art. And so I got involved with this project, the Journey Project, and the spirit of participation and inclusion and so on. I got sucked in, and then I was the lighting artist and the software lead for this, not because I knew what I was doing, but because I was willing. And then so this went on to the Sacred Journey, was a temple at a local event. And that was enough that by 2018, I was ready, I thought maybe to lead my own project. And by this time we had some other professors involved. Dr. David Oss and Hoople were involved, and Nate Pardee came in later and made Unfolding Humanity for 2018. And we liked that so much, then we started Art Builds together, and Art Builds has done these three things on the bottom. I'll just say in between, I did this independently with another group called the Math Collective. I was the lighting artist here, and these lights sort of pulse in a way to make the bridge look alive. This was a summer Sure project for some engineering students. It was a challenge that we gave him to design something that we could design carefully and then purchase things on the way to the event and construct on site. And that was a prototype for what we did last year. So that was Emergence. This is Re-emergence. It's twice as tall, twice as long. This is Reflection, which is some spinnable mirrored columns. Wasn't for Burning Man, but we got a commission from we got a grant from the city to bring it to La Jolla Cove. So anyways, so I've done the lighting on these, and it's been really an exciting experience for me. And if you feel like your curiosity has been piqued at all by this, I just found out that we got a grant from Burning Man to bring this piece back. And so it's coming back this year, and in the spirit of radical inclusion, if you'd like to be involved, if you want to help us with any of the refurbishing, if you want to help with any part of it, just let me know. I'd love to have you. Thank you.
Good. I'm old school.
You're old school.
Yep.
Well, I'm not good.
No, you're good. Yeah. Yeah, Diane, that was really brilliant and lovely and inspiring. My presentation will be none of those things. So it's a bit of a provocation, I suppose. The title of it is Once a Desert of Thought, Now More Illusion Than Mirage. The university was once a desert of thought. Today, the university is maybe a mirage of thinking, or better still, maybe an illusion of thinking. What's the difference? Or What's the difference? That's to say, what differentiates a mirage from an illusion, or who cares? The desert always gets to me. It gets to me because it gets me thinking that I do not know what to think. I go to the desert out of curiosity or when desiring reprieve from urban and suburban social political life, to detoxify by escapist diversion into nature's sauna. And it helps until, that is, I really leave the hotel and actually enter the desert. And once there, I really don't know how or what to think, neither about the desert itself, nor its effects on me. You will speak for yourself, of course, but I think the desert leaves the most articulate and learned among us floundering, reducing us to really bad poets, or those encyclopedists that know what the desert is in one sense, but still manage to miss its relation to human meaning and thus understanding nothing of it in another sense. Surely anyone trained in understanding some feature of the desert and its relevance to human meaning, for example, and these are of course just examples, the scientist, the religious studies scholar, the anthropologist, the park ranger, and so on, can provide information about the desert and its natural, cultural, historical, symbolic value. But each partial presentation of the whole can only go so far without soon meeting with the most neutralizing of conversational rejoinders, the one that nearly always displays irony. That's interesting. Such information is not what we are after when the desert is after us. We can understand loads of natural, cultural, historical, and symbolic facts about the desert without understanding a single thing about why the desert provokes the human imagination, awe, wonder, perplexity, and confusion. When we visit the desert, we do not inhabit the scientific desert, and we no longer inhabit the world of those who really contended with the desert, the ancient Babylonians and Israelites, explorers, and so on. Science surely can explain the desert's material composition and function, can demythologize and show to be incorrect ordinary beliefs about this supposedly barren and lifeless place. But that constitutes a certain kind of meaningless meaning. Interesting for sure, but an absurdity in the very sense of deaf, dull, and out of tune. For a scientist, as a scientist, scientific meaning regarding the desert provides meaning. For a scientist as contemplative agent, the scientific meaning equally provides no meaning. As to what the scholarly social sciences can tell us about the desert, we can come to know, that is to say, we can be informed about how the desert factored into various cultures and cultural meanings in various places across various times in human history. But we do not inhabit that meaning. We cannot inhabit that meaning. We are left with our own bad poetry and feeble contemplations. The desert confronted, the desert thought beyond its natural elements of cultural meanings no longer inhabitable, leaves my thought deserted, like the biggest of those questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is there this kind of something rather than nothing? No matter how much sense we can impart to the desert via these various natural and social sciences, the desert remains before us a stark reminder of what we cannot say. Its being makes no sense to us, zero. I think we have to admit this claim, or at the very least take it very seriously, and that is what the French journalist and existential author Albert Camus did so unflinchingly. In The Myth of Sisyphus and other essays, Camus presents a desert refrain. With regret, he notes the following, quote, "There are no more deserts, yet there is a need for them. In order to understand the world, one has to turn away from it on occasion. In order to serve men better, one has to hold them at a distance for a time. But where can one find the solitude necessary to vigor, the deep breath in which the mind collects itself?" Close quote. To that question, Camus offers a suggestive response of a rather broad nature. Quote again, "The desert itself has assumed significance. For all of the world's sorrows, it is a hallowed spot. But at certain moments, the heart wants nothing so much as spots devoid of poetry. Descartes, planning to meditate, chose his desert, the most mercantile city of his era. There he found his solitude and the occasion for perhaps the greatest of our virile poems." Quote, "The first precept was never to accept anything as true unless I knew it to be obviously so," close quote. It is possible to have less ambition and the same nostalgia as Descartes. In order to flee poetry and yet recapture the peace of stones, other deserts are needed, other spots without soul and without reprieve, close quote. These remarks do not praise Descartes. Neither Descartes nor the skeptics to whom he responds entered the desert, or the desert of thought, as Camus calls it elsewhere, because neither faced what Camus calls the absurd. To outline what Camus dislikes about Descartes' thought, then, may help us grasp what Camus means by the absurd, which is the same as grasping what Camus means by the desert of thought to which he encourages us to return. Camus oddly characterizes Descartes' philosophical method and ambition as a great poem, a remark to which both poets and philosophers presumably would take offense, albeit for different reasons. Descartes, as many of you will know, uses the method of skepticism, the method of doubt, against itself in order to prove that which skepticism thinks in principle unprovable, namely the possibility of having any certain knowledge about anything whatsoever in the universe. Camus encourages, however, less ambition, but the same nostalgia as Descartes. He encourages us, after having remarked about Descartes' meditations as perhaps the greatest of our virile poems, to quote, flee poetry, close quote, in order to quote, recapture the piece of stones, close quote. Descartes, as I read Camus, fled the desert of thought rather than entering it. Using his power of reason, Descartes finds a reprieve from skepticism by arriving via the road of doubt, via the road of skeptical method, at an indubitable and certain truth in the mode of the impossibility of doubting one's own existence. One proves one's existence precisely in the very attempt to doubt that one exists. And in his poem that is almost a desert of thought, Descartes finds certainty in his own existence as a thinking thing or a thing that thinks, a disembodied soul, pure life, pure sense, pure animus, no desert. Descartes did not engage the absurd, he tried to silence it. In doing so, Descartes provided Western culture with a reprieve from skepticism, but he left it deserted, a disembodied soul without deserts. And Camus says, however, that we need places, quote, without soul and without reprieve, close quote. That is to say, we need deserts. Camus diametrically opposes the absurd to Descartes' conviction regarding the human mind's ability to arrive at certain knowledge impervious to doubt. In such a flight from the desert of thought, Descartes' poetry could not manifest the absurd. The admission that, as Camus puts it, quote, the world in itself is not reasonable, and that is all that can be said, close quote. Enter the desert. Camus describes the absurd as the confrontation of the irrational universe with the innate human longing for explanation, understanding, and clarity. Quote, the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart, close quote, or the aforementioned nostalgia. The absurd human being, very much unlike Descartes, concerns herself with not explaining and solving, but experiencing and describing. Such is where the desert leaves the honest agent of contemplation. Alluding to the desert of thought in which one might make manifest the absurd, that is to say, going forward in the face of the moment when one realizes that the universe does not give a damn about human being and its wild longing for order, understanding, and meaning, Camus writes the following, quote, the method defined here acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible, solely appearances can be enumerated, and the climate makes itself felt. Certain men, starting from a critique of rationalism, have admitted the absurd climate, close quote. Feeling, climate, atmosphere, mood. This is neither a natural or social science, nor is it a philosophy, nor is it a poetry. Camus does not mean that the knowledge that we gain via the sciences, whether natural or social, is valueless. Camus wasn't naive, and he wasn't anti-science, and he wasn't anti-reason, but he was anti-scientism and anti-rationalism. That is to say, he did not think that we should equate meaning with the knowledge provided by science or rational calculation. The repetition of the concept of climate harkens to a mood, an atmosphere, a feeling, or an affective encounter of oneself, of human being, with the universe in all of its indifferent silence. As Camus notes of the absurd thought, or the thought of the absurd, or the desert of thought, it, quote, sums itself up as a lucid invitation to live and create in the very midst of the desert, close quote. That is to say, in the midst of the confrontation between the human longing to know and the irrational universe that remains silent in response to our queries regarding the meaning of it, that science, reason, history, culture, and symbolic demonstration alone cannot capture. The method that Camus' Desert of Thought advises is not only one that acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible, but it is also one that speculates that, quote, solely appearances can be enumerated, close quote. Whatever Camus means by the desert of thought, I want in the remaining portions of the presentation, perhaps imprudently to play in this theoretical space, to play around with the notion of the desert of thought for no purpose otherwise than to enumerate appearances. But I am no absurdist in the sense that Camus identifies. I reject the entailments around Camus' idea that solely appearances can be enumerated, as if appearances were but mere appearances and thus somehow deficient modes of apprehending reality, or reality that hides always behind an appearance. Like Camus, I would wish to avoid the pitfalls of rationalism and scientism on the one hand, and the methodological skepticism on the other hand. Unlike Camus, however, I do not want the desert of thought to metaphorically convey the standpoint of a curious mind confronting in heroic defiance the universe's silent refusal of our deepest wishes. Even if we must remain on guard against scientism and rationalism, appearances are not mere appearances. Being presents in many ways, no one of which captures the whole of being. Although being always operates as a horizon, it is one that affords apprehension, contemplation, and so on. What a beautiful paradox, a desert of thought. Does that phrase mean a thought not alive, no longer alive, or not yet born? Maybe neither, since, as the desert itself reminds us, all that is alive or has a soul exists, although not all that exists has a soul or is alive. Does a desert of thought mean an abandoned thought or a deserted thought? Notice the temporal dimensions that each hypothetical interpretive option entails. Does each not have its own way of being or appearing that is no mere appearance, even if each moment in the manifold of appearances does not claim to be the whole of being? Why conclude that the past no longer exists? We believe that unperceived places and spaces exist. Does the past not also exist? Perhaps the past exists like the desert does, seemingly fixed and unchanged. Are we deserted by the past, or do we desert the past? Consider the repetition of ruminations and obsessive thoughts that enter the mind unwelcome, like the desert's haunting seams. I refrain from overquoting Faulkner. I am now a bad poet. Maybe the desert of thought expresses the thought that, switching from the past to the present, that surprises us, as deserts too surprise us. Deserts surprise us, such as when they show life unexpected. Latent vegetation may spring ephemerally. Desert reptile may crawl upon us like a harsh thought that slithers into one's consciousness unforeseen and startling. All surprise, pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad, presents in the present. And yet again, perhaps the thought of the desert of thought as a thought not yet born suggests hope, turning our minds to the futural mode of appearing the desert of thought. And there is nothing dead or deadening in hope, although in hope we remain in the domain of the non-existent, with respect at least to that for which we hope. Might hope reside in the desert? What another wonderful paradox, hope symbolized in the desert. I am not sure how best to interpret Camus on this point, but to bring these interpretive options together with Camus' earlier mention of Descartes, perhaps the desert of thought describes the contemplative activity of going into a novel place or space on thought, a novel place outside of the urbane or mundane, or what is the same, the banal. The desert of thought may be, that is to say, may mean, that thought that common sense thinks or believes to be sterile, barren, or infertile. Such supposedly is actually the nature of the university. The state of the contemporary university, however, itself has become vulgar in the original sense of common, and to that extent also exists, to plan a phrase from a thinker who I dislike and so I shall not name, an inability to think otherwise. The political philosopher Michael Oakeshott, whom I quite like, once reminded us that the locus or the where of the university existed by design as a place beyond the here and now. Once was, we might say, a desert of thought. As Oakeshott puts the matter starkly, quote, "In times past, English universities have been indolent guardians of the engagement to educate, and as often they have recovered. But for more than a generation now, they have anticipated almost every design of governments to transform them into instruments of socialization, hardly needing to be bribed to undertake this destruction of themselves," close quote. Socialization is meant here to capture all the recipe ingredients for a free and happy life thought according to the market and the dominant ideology of the day, namely outcomes-based instrumentalism. And to grasp what gets lost in the deformation of education into socialization, consider Oakeshott's view of the liberating nature of the university as originally construed. Quote, "What makes a place of learning singularizes it by its exceptionality. What is special about such a place or circumstance is its seclusion, its detachment from what Hegel called the hic et nunc, the here and now of current living. There in school, the narrow boundaries of the local and contemporary were swept aside to reveal not what might be going on in the next village or town, in Parliament or the United Nations, but a world of things and persons and happenings, of languages and beliefs, of utterances and sights and sounds, past all imagination, to which even the dullest could not be wholly indifferent," close quote. Its seclusion, a desert perhaps, singularized and made exceptional the university. But as the contemporary academy increasingly and ceaselessly reduces itself to the primary forces of the banal, capital and practical utility, and instrumental actions of science and politics, it exemplifies a dearth of thought rather than a desert of thought. One might object and say this is not the right play. This is not the right analogy, for the desert is a place or a space that precludes utility and generates thought, or generates thought precisely because it precludes utility, while a contemporary university is a place in which thought withers precisely because the contemporary university prioritizes utility and socialization over scholarship and thinking for its own sake. Still, the university presents as a place that remains, or at the very least presents an appearance of an enduring respect for the desert of thought. If the university perhaps once was a halo, the contemporary university now looks more like an illusion than a mirage. Or maybe I'm just making a joke about hot air, since I'm playing with thoughts about the desert of thought. What's the difference? Different elemental conditions produce different phenomena. The desert has its mirage, the cloud its halo, the water droplets its rainbow. Of these three, only the mirage is thought as nothing, no real thing, but an appearance, a mere appearance, as if it were not the distinctive phenomena that it is. Whereas we tend to demean the mirage, we marvel at the rainbow and the halo as legitimate, not illusory phenomena, a fleeting moment of beauty that calls our attention to the extraordinary, so much so that the lucky one first to behold it hearkens others, even strangers, to join attention and marvel along. The rainbow and the halo each marks one of life's beauties that fills the moment in time by fulfilling the fortunate viewer momentarily. The mirage, however, is often thought not to fulfill, but to disappoint. Common sense takes a mirage as a mere appearance or something that it believes to be nothing. Science tells common sense that it is not quite correct. Science tells us that the mirage is not, science tells us that the mirage is a nothing, that is a something, atmospherically speaking. In any case, each takes the mirage as a mere appearance. Heading back to the beginning, isn't a mirage an illusion? And so isn't this speculation about the contemporary university pointing to a distinction without a difference? Not at all. In the visual or optical illusions, our minds see what it expects to see or has been trained to see, rather than what our eyes really see. A mirage, by contrast, is a physical phenomena that happens before us. When one sees a mirage, one sees exactly what is there to be seen. There is no trick of perception or incongruity between what is presented on the side of the world and what is apprehended on the side of the perceiver. That is what an illusion is, that a mirage is not, namely an incongruity between what is presented on the side of the world and what is apprehended on the side of the perceiver. Hence precisely the magic of the illusionist or the magician. A mirage is not an illusion in the same sense that a visual illusion is an illusion, because when we see a mirage, we perceive something that is really there, the intersection of really hot ground and much cooler air. The mirage really is there. It is a real phenomena. It is not a mere appearance or visual trick. The illusion is deceptive. The mirage is miraculous. Consider the etymology of the term mirage, now optical illusion of object reflected in a sheet of water in hot sandy deserts from the 1800s, in translation of French work from the French mirage, from se mirare, to be reflected, from the Latin mirare, or the French word is from Latin mirus, or wonderful, or miracle. The similarity to Arabic mirage has been noted, but the usual sense of the word here in the Arabic means ladder or stairs, climb, ascent, whereas the standard Arabic for a desert mirage is sarab. The figurative sense of the deceptive appearance of a delusive seeming occurs in 1812. The phenomena is produced by excessive bending of light rays through layers of different air densities, producing distorted, displaced, inverted images. The demeaning misunderstanding of a mirage is even more striking when we recall its Latin root in that sheer sense of a miracle or a mirare, conveyed in the sense of to look at, as in to admire or to wonder. Perhaps the contemporary university, once a desert of thought in which we found that rare phenomena that is a mirage, is now more illusion than mirage.
So, wow. Super humbling to follow that. Thank you both for those great talks. And I also want to thank Lindy and Brian for the invitation to speak as part of this series. It's always fun to be part of a college where there's so much intellectual engagement with issues so brilliantly directed by Brian. Because we're here also to look at this exhibition, I want to thank my colleagues, Susie Smith and Chandler Hubbard, who are here, and this wouldn't look as good as it does without either of them. So I hope you'll take a chance and see it tonight. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to telescope this talk a little bit and leap over some things I had planned to say, just because I don't want to test your patience. But I had a lot of ideas as I was preparing this, thinking about this problem of remarking landscapes and the presumed unremarkability of desert landscapes. And I was reminded of a book I read in graduate school by Jeffrey Hartman, where he does this tour de force analysis of William Wordsworth's poetry, where he takes in each chapter a different mode of interpretive analysis. One is a Marxist analysis, and then a psychoanalytic analysis, and then a feminist analysis of Wordsworth, in order to show that Wordsworth's fundamental ability to change lyric poetry was based on his unremarkability. The fact that he was doing things in these tropes that were so commonplace as they could be shared by all. And I thought about the desert and my wish to sort of do a Hartmanian analysis of it, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to talk about really the prehistory to what Diane spoke so beautifully about at Burning Man and other places, where the desert is the locus of so much creative force. Wow. So I want to think about the fact that the desert has always been in this position of being remarked upon by others. And I mean physically remarked upon. So I'm showing you this very famous photograph by Timothy H. O'Sullivan, which is of a site about 75 miles west of Albuquerque called Inscription Rock, where there are traces by the Spanish conquistadors of earlier presence, right? So here's something written in 1626. And I'm imagining Timothy O'Sullivan with his large view camera hovering above this inscription, thinking about what had been written there 250 years before as part of a project to reinscribe this landscape for the property of the United States, because that's in fact what Wheeler and these other surveyors were trying to do. They were trying to map the fastest route to the West Coast for the railroads. They were trying to map the places where extractive economies could be most effective at pulling out the mineral resources of this place. And so part of this record, which is also, you know, kind of punning reference here between O'Sullivan's ruler and reference to the Spanish rulers of the time. There's all this effort to bring this all back under the control of the United States and the geological surveys that were happening at this moment. And so I think, well, I know O'Sullivan is aware of the irony of his own capturing of this record. He's aware of it because he's also photographing places like Canyon de Chalet and other sites where evidence, the incontrovertible evidence of prior occupation of these places was absolutely clear to him and to everybody else who was on these expeditions. So I think even though this had been abandoned for hundreds of years, by the time O'Sullivan's there, he is photographing it to tell us there were others already here before us. And so, you know, I think it's important, as I've suggested, to put this into the context of what someone like O'Sullivan is doing. He's gathering this information to send back to Washington and to send back to other people who are primarily there to exploit this new area. And so not just photographers, this is an incredible photograph which shows O'Sullivan's surveying wagon and then the footsteps that he takes across the sand dunes to place his camera so he can get that photograph of that transportation device. It's the same thing really that Albert Bierstadt shows us, as he was also part of one of these survey expeditions moving west, sort of ceaselessly west, and gathering sketches like this to convince others to invest in this huge opportunity. We have a name for this. It's called Manifest Destiny. And you know, an image like this one by Francis Palmer is sort of, it's ludicrous in a way that it represents this thirst for taking control over this new territory, which I've said already was already known to be occupied by other people. So here you have the industrious white settlers laying ruin to all of the natural wonders of this place, their industries growing out, the railroad moving ever forward towards the West Coast, and the native peoples left to inhale the smoke of that industrial conquest. rainforest. So this was an incredibly popular print, not because of the reasons I just suggested, but because it demonstrated exactly what the motives of this westward exploration across the desert was what they were. It's tempting to me to offer a completely alternative history at this point to this, to suggest that there is another representational tradition that we could put in the place of this that would tell the story from another side. This is a ledger drawing I acquired for the Hood Museum of Art when I was the director of that institution, and it's part of a whole family of images that Native peoples made, in this case, while they were incarcerated, right, to show their active resistance to that westward thrust through the deserts of the Southwest. Even though I said I wasn't going to do a whole talk about this, I just want to point to the fact that there is this incredibly rich tradition of Native experience and representation of desert environments, which I'm going to just sort of point at and move on today. I'm showing you work by Harrison Begay, who's represented in USD's collection. You should go check it out in the print room sometime, but he was a Native artist schooled at the Santa Fe Studio School, which was this benevolent group that were trying to train Native artists so that they could be commercially successful enough to sustain themselves. But Begay is different because he not only goes through that process, he ends up at Black Mountain College, where he's one of a very few Native students, and he's being trained by Bauhaus artists who were emigres from, well, they were refugees from Nazi Germany at the time, and they were teaching artists like Begay to see things in a totally different way. And so he becomes this representation, not just for me, but for other people, of the modernist Native artist post this period of their incarceration and limited opportunities. But I guess I want to also point towards these other histories of desert representation and these voices in the so-called wilderness. This is an ironic idea, but somebody like Child Hassan, who's trained in France and neck painting as close as he could to Claude Monet, and comes to represent that for Americans in the East Coast, mostly in places like New York or Boston, but he also gets out to the West Coast early on to paint murals in San Francisco and also in Portland, Oregon. And while he's there, he's painting these impressionist desert scenes right at the turn of the century on commission for Charles Erskine Scott Wood, who was his great patron in these efforts to try to give visibility to this beautiful painted desert of Oregon. He's not alone. In fact, he sort of precedes, but just barely, a whole group of artists like Marsden Hartley, also somebody who was working alongside German artists when he was in Berlin, comes back to New Mexico under the patronage of people like Mabel Dodge Lujan, who was this great organizer of these salons that included people like D.H. Lawrence and Marsden Hartley, all painting this desert in this modernist vocabulary that they had just picked up from their experience abroad. And maybe the most important of these painters of the desert is Georgia O'Keeffe, right? Because she, in 1929, takes her first trip to New Mexico. She's actually part of a group that's being entertained by Lujan at her salon in Taos. Ultimately decides that she's not going to return to New York. By 1935, she had bought her first property in New Mexico, and she's just completely enamored of this landscape that she sees. Ultimately, in 1945, she buys the home in Abiquiu that she lived in until her death in 1986, and she basically stays there, even though she remained married to her husband, the gallerist and sort of impresario Alfred Stieglitz. She's basically rooted in that desert and painting it every day, right? So she can walk out into the hills beyond her home in Abiquiu and paint this kind of environment, which is endlessly interesting to her. So the opposite of the unremarkable. It's fascinating every day for O'Keeffe. And she tells us, just in this quote, which I'm not going to read, but I'm just going to ask you to believe me. It talks about her daily experience as an experience of wonder, right? Daily wonder. She's not alone. She goes first to New Mexico with Rebecca Strand, who was her companion and lover probably at this time. And fewer people know the work that Rebecca Strand does, which is these tiny little miniatures, reverse paintings on glass. They're 2 by 3 inches each of them, and they're exquisite objects that have this inherent fragility to them. And this is just an image that Strand makes about the same time. I'm not quite sure how that shell gets to the desert, but it's part of that fiction of the American desert that Strand is sort of shared with O'Keeffe. Here in California, you have a whole group of these people who flock to places like Anza Borrego to paint the mountains beyond. So I'm just showing you Sadakichi Hartman, who's maybe best known for having been Walt Whitman's biographer, but was also a poet. And he ends up in California in the Southlands, living by himself, impoverished. So he had no resources whatsoever. He would have to hitchhike into Riverside in order to find his, groceries and things like that. And he's trying to sell his poetry, sell plays to anybody who will buy them. But because he's so taken with this natural environment that most people would have considered really hard to endure, he's able to sustain himself in his last years, not very far from where we're standing today. And the same is true of artists like Edward Weston. So I'm just showing you 2 of Weston's photographs of that same region I was just speaking about, the Mojave and the Anza Borrego Desert. It seems to me we've seen this photograph a couple of times before in this series, but just not attributed to Weston, who was really the originator of these great images. Or I think about somebody like Ansel Adams and sort of the myth around the creation of this high desert image of Moonrise Hernandez, where he, said that he just pulled off of, I think it's US Highway 285 with his view camera ready to go, and takes this picture in a matter of minutes, and then goes back to realize he's created one of the icons of modern photography. Probably not true, but it's still a kind of compelling way to think about how the desert just appears as a kind of miraculous mirage in front of the artist to be recorded in this way. I think it's important also to understand that at the very moment that Adams is producing these fine art images of the desert, he's also involved in this US government. He did this actually for the US government. It was going to be a mural in a treasury building in New York City, but he's also trying to normalize the incarceration of Japanese American people in places like Manzanar. So I'm just sort of fascinated by the placement of that volleyball in the sky and the moon over Hernandez, and sort of imagining that Ansel Adams just is looking for these things as he inhabits these places. By the 1950s, you get another group of artists who are less interested in romanticizing the desert experience than in giving it a kind of hard critical edge. So I'm showing you this image from the Swiss artist Robert Frank's great Guggenheim book, The Americans, where he goes across the country, follows Route 66, and photographs, in this case, the tragic results of a car accident outside of Flagstaff, or between Winslow and Flagstaff, and remembering how in that book, Jack Kerouac provides this sort of beat, scat narrative that supervises the whole thing, which ends with the phrase, Robert Frank, you got eyes, right? That Frank somehow had encapsulated the American experience in a way that other photographers, including Adams and Weston, had not. But this is a much more sinister view of what the American West was than had been put forward previously. So that takes us a little bit into, well, my life, not many of your lives as students, but the work that people like Michael Heiser did in the desert in the late 1960s, early 70s. So Michael Heiser was the son of a Berkeley archaeologist named Robert Heiser, who had spent his entire career doing excavations in the American Southwest of native peoples. And he brought his F student, Michael, with him to the deserts. And Michael Heiser just started riding around in motorcycles, creating these sort of pre-Burning Man imagery in the desert. And his idea was, and he called this earthworks. He liked to say, still likes to say, that he invented the term earthworks. But this land art that was meant to be seen from space, right, by some extraterrestrial being would be able to make these out. Whereas on the surface of the desert itself, it's kind of unremarkable, right? You just sort of see the scoring of the motorcycle tires across the space. And you do these large mammoth drawings in the desert of Nevada as a kind of precursor to the work that he later did at Double Negative and some of the great sites of the American earthwork movement. I just want to spend a moment to talk about City, which is in its own way the parallel to Burning Man in terms of this single artist creation. So for the last 52 years, Michael Heiser by himself has been moving land in the middle of the desert, not too far from where you were talking about, out beyond Reno and it's beyond all the bombing testing sites that the government has but doesn't talk about there. And he's been creating this enormous monumental city, which will never be inhabited, right? And so it's just thousands of acres of land which are groomed as if people had lived there. And only recently, last September, did it finally reach a point where he said it was complete, where you could actually go if you could make an appointment to go visit it yourself. But you have to be willing to invest time and effort, and it's a completely non-commercial experience. So also like what you were saying, Diane, about Burning Man, it's intended to be beyond the market, right? Who would buy this thing? And perhaps only the son of an archaeologist could imagine making this place, which is full of these boulevards that have never seen vehicles, these temples which were never worshipped at, and that's been his primary, I don't know, Sally, what would you say? His primary legacy has been this work. Which takes us sort of to the moment that I wanted to use to introduce this exhibition, which these artists who are interested in the desert have since the 70s, and maybe since the example of Michael Heiser, taken another view, which is not this panoramic, large-scale view of the desert, but something more focused. So Brian and I both admire the work of Via Selmans a great deal. At one point, we thought about bringing her work here to USD, but these close inspections, a little bit like Timothy O'Sullivan hovering above Inscription Rock with his view camera, but she's just determined to show you every nuance of that pebbly surface of the desert with all of its fidelity to actual observation. She's working on this, and it struck me. I was in Maastricht in the Netherlands last weekend and saw this work, which is Nikki de Saint-Phal's image of the same desert, but from this almost surrealist perspective. She's paying homage to Max Ernst, who was one of these German emigre artists who ended up passing through on that Route 66 to the West Coast. And this is actually, as I discovered, a kind of literal translation of a story that Jimmy Ernst told about his father's voyage, that I guess Jimmy was on it, and what they saw when they passed across the desert. We're stuck today with this view of the desert, and I think the talks have suggested it's immense, that's spreading out, that's full of all the mirage and marvelous that the desert might offer us, but that is somehow always needing further representation. I'm showing you this work by Richard Misrak because he's been photographing as part of his desert cantos this very desert since I think it's 1974. So he just goes back again and again and is creating this large epic document of it. Those images we saw of Canyon de Chelly and the native residences there, they're being recreated to some degree by an artist like Andrea Zittel, who's since 2000 taken an 88-acre site near Joshua Tree and populated it with her own works. So these are little lodgings where you could actually spend the night and live in this environment that Zittel has created for us to sort of reintroduce us into that habitat that had been observed by Timothy O'Sullivan so many years before. All of this was really to set us up for the exhibition, which I'm going to stop, I promise, very quickly, but that opened yesterday, thanks to Susie and Chandler, and which shows the work of the British artist, Emma Stibbon, who for the last 4 or 5 years has been traveling out as part of her investigations of extreme environments to the desert of the Southwest, which she'd only known ever before through its filmic representations and trying to know that as this specific kind of place. I hope when you go to this exhibition, you'll enjoy the ways in which she has taken so many different approaches to what may already be familiar to us, because we're lucky enough to live close by to this place. Those of you who are lucky enough to be taking a class with Beth and Brian may get out there within the next few days. And I think it's full of surprise. It's a truly remarkable place. Thanks.
Well, thank you really so much. So much about that. We have time for a couple of questions on reflections and observations from the floor. So, please, anyone next door?
Nobody? I had cousins here from France a few years ago, and they tried to rent a motorhome, and they were doing it right when Burning Man was about to happen, and there was not one motorhome for rent in all of Southern California, Nevada, Arizona, or up towards Sacramento. But they were all gone, and all the dealers said they're all at Burning Man. I was there. You had to buy one.
I'm struck by almost the contrast but complementary nature of these 3 presentations in terms of the ideation of a desert and the desert as absence, as black, and kind of the opposite of creativity, and Siri apparently has something about that. With the creations that come from Michelle and all the kind of the art kind of traditions that are coming out of the desert. And so that was just kind of more of a comment and reflection. But it's a fascinating kind of journey through the desert as intellectual and artistic moment or stuff or space. The desert itself is actually quite fragile. To do something like that, ride your motorbike, those scars last a tremendously long time. So I don't know, it's kind of, in Burning Man, when they have it, they're so careful not to try to respect that feeling.
Even if you, so we have these 4-foot tall earth anchors to anchor your art down so that it doesn't blow away, and you have to, every hole that you make, you take and store the dirt somewhere so that you can then pack it back in, and yeah, it's really restored to original condition. And I think it helps that it's a dried lake bed, so in the winter it's a lake, and it sort of, I think, even sings out a little bit for the next time.
I think it's really interesting when considering the desert, particularly that the Coachella Valley, as showcasing that picture of the man selling his poetry, looking at it as illusion, as mirage, in the way that's manifested in that area, particularly in the terms of oases and the architecture and the enclave that exists there. Now being desert oases, these ideas that are paramount, and not the support services and the people who live and work there, but really the ideal structures of people visiting. So I love that photo, and I think it's just really interesting to see the illusion of a oasis within the desert that exists now.
So many things that's it. Like that's pretty struggle with the under the net and then go about that's second reference in different side. And you don't have to see that guys up going out because it's your mode of thinking philosophically when you're out there. Just yourself? What is it like to go out there?
I said what I could at the beginning. It's a space where I feel like I generate hardly any productive thoughts about the desert, but the absence of an ability to think about the object before me, you know, and the silences that are kind of around there are very helpful for me in terms of creating the space to do certain kinds of thinking, but that are not about the desert, right? It's in the way that the desert affords kind of space for art to be done. It affords a certain kind of open space for intellectual activity that I find hard to kind of carve out here in these kind of ordinary spaces. But to think about the desert itself, I'm quite honest when I say that I'm lost. You know, it's like kind of learn, you know, Beth gives a presentation on the desert and the scientific elements of it, and I learn a ton. You know, but otherwise it's productive for me in terms of thinking about my work, but not in terms of thinking about the desert or about what the desert says to me about the insignificance of me. Yeah. Thanks.
And last observation, by the way.
No, I noticed that all the imagery that we've seen is really been generated within the transportation era, the modern transportation era. You know, the photographs, you know, well, I guess the wagon wheels isn't really that modern, but most of what you see, you know, that we look at now is it's so easy to just drive to the desert, it's easy to drive across the desert. You know, you've got cell phones and you have all kinds of ways of communicating, but think of what it was like for people that crossed the desert. They maybe had one guide and were there just with wagons and oxen. Take them a long time to get where they were going. And it was, you know, I imagine a lot of people didn't make it.
Thank you all very much. And just an advert for what you might do in the 10 to 15 minutes before the Humanities Center closes. Now would be the perfect time to take a look at the new exhibition, Desert Sublime Southwestern Landscape by Emma Stibbon, which is in the art gallery, which will be open for the next 20 minutes or so. So please take a look, read the brochure. A great interview with Derrick and Emma Stibbon in it. Very enlightening about all of those of you who enjoy the desert. Such in the same way, these three talks were really, really well for that end. So thank you very, very much, and we'll see you all next week.